Chris Lynch News with Airpark Canterbury. Trusted parking, backing trusted news.
And Labour leader Chris Hipkins joins me. Good evening to you.
Good evening.
Nice to see you. Let's discuss the consenting changes. I know you've put out a press release today saying Labour supports building more homes at pace, but not by compromising on public safety, leaving tradespeople to carry all the risk. In other words, we're going to be allowing plumbers, gas fitters and drain layers to self-certify. That possibly sounds like a recipe for leaky building syndrome to come again. What are your thoughts on this and what are your concerns?
I think we're always open to sensible changes that the government might want to make around the regulatory regime for building. So I think it's like the sleep out rules, the granny flat rules that they did. I think we're broadly supportive of some of those changes. But when we're talking about things like self-certification, the certification regime's got to be proportionate to risk. So if you think about a gas fitter, for example, if they make a mistake, if they get things wrong, if those mistakes aren't picked up, things can literally blow up. They can literally explode. And so I think it is important that there are enough sort of safety standards, enough checks and balances in there that we're not going to see that sort of thing. I don't think anyone in New Zealand wants to see a repeat of the leaky buildings fiasco. There was all about a rush to deregulate, a rush to make everything faster, a rush to make everything cheaper. And look what happened. We paid a very big long-term consequence for that.
Back in my mind, self-certification just sounds dodgy, but the government is saying for its press releases anyway that it will be a very high threshold with trusted building companies. Does that make you feel slightly better?
I think it does have to be proportionate to risk. So where the risk is high, there should be really, good, strong quality controls in place. Where the risk is low, then self-certification can be justified. So I think it's got to be proportionate to risk.
Let's discuss some local issues now. Selwyn residents are paying their fair share of taxes, but data released earlier this week shows the district is missing out on about $369 million in government investment. Once again, this does feel like Canterbury is being left to fend for itself. What do you say?
I think there were some really interesting insights into that data. I'd be interested to see what other places that have grown really fast around the country, how they compare with Selwyn as well. Selwyn's grown very fast, clearly hasn't had the level of investment in it that is needed to cope with that significant population growth that the Selwyn district's seen. There's more investment that's going to be required there. I don't think you can get away from that. So I think it's raised some, pretty legitimate questions about whether Selwyn's getting its fair share of the pie.
It's not just with Selwyn, but it's other parts, particularly here in Christchurch, when the government pulled away some of its transport funding and redirected it, some of its NZTO funding and redirected it to, Brougham Street and Pages Road, and we're all led to believe this is the best thing since a slice of bread. Do you have concerns that, Christchurch is being left behind?
Well, I have some concerns that the government overall is leaving the South Island behind. I think that the South Island is not getting its proportionate or its share of investment in big infrastructure. Certainly that's the case in transport. But if you look at other things that they're doing, even things like the Dunedin Hospital, Nelson Hospital, plenty of examples there of where the government are sort of pulling back from the South Island right at a time when there's a really strong case for doing more.
But we've got a South Island minister now. Isn't that supposed to solve all the problems?
Yeah, well, the very most junior minister in Cabinet who isn't actually involved in most of the Cabinet discussions around where this money's being spent. So I think that's a PR exercise rather than anything of substance.
Quite possibly. The Catering Museum, I don't know if you know much about this, but it's the redevelopment. Once again, like everything in Christchurch, it's blown its budget, out to $247 million. It needs another $86 million to fill this funding gap. Ratepayers are being asked to, consider the consultation process, whether we should pay, but also it looks like the museum will go to the government and say, more money, please. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think there's a case for central government support for some of these bigger projects, museums being a good case in point. I think from memory, our government put in something around the $50 million mark into that project. I have to go back and check that. But we do see value in central government supporting these sorts of projects. There's been cost escalations all over the place. And ultimately, the scale of that redevelopment really is a question for local government. But central government should play a role.
You've said, I want to talk to more other issues now, particularly on I think it was your Facebook page, and they were discussing the whole woman issue and all that kind of stuff. But you made some points saying that Labor wants to get back to talking about what really matters, such as raising living standards beyond wage growth, which is really important because there are plenty of people suffering out there, even on the middle income brackets now. So I want you to specifically tell me what immediate actions, if you were in government, would you take to ease the cost of living for ordinary New Zealanders, but without relying on government handouts or subsidies?
In my State of the Nation speech earlier in the year, I said that jobs, health and homes are going to be the three key priority areas for our next government. Getting people back into work, making sure that work pays, so making sure their incomes are keeping up with their rising costs, making sure that we're keeping people healthy so that our health system doesn't end up grinding to a halt in the way that it is at the moment, and making sure that people have got a place to call home, a place where they can put down roots. Those, I think, should be the priority areas for our next Labor government. In terms of issues around the cost of living, there are things that government can do. I think we've had a lot of hot air from the current government about the lack of competition in the food and grocery sector, but not really much action. And I think action is required there. Similarly, in electricity, if you look at the availability, the abundant availability of renewable electricity in New Zealand, renewable energy in New Zealand, which can be harnessed for electricity, we shouldn't be paying the ridiculously high prices that we are at the moment. The fact that electricity prices are going up right now at a time when we should be focused on more renewable electricity generation, more stable, if anything, lower electricity prices, government can do something about that. We shouldn't be losing all these jobs to overseas because power prices in New Zealand are driving away our manufacturing industries. So I think leadership from government in those areas will make a difference to New Zealand's overall living standards. It'll mean that we get more people into work and that they can earn better incomes.
I saw a story the other day saying line companies here in Canterbury are increasing their charges, which will go down to the retailers. But it seems like, Ms. Hipkins, we hear this every time just a month out from winter. It doesn't seem new. Do you know what I mean? It seems like every time we're hearing that all the prices going up this winter, you never hear about prices coming down.
No, that's right. And it isn't new. And it's because as a country, we haven't actually placed enough emphasis on making sure that we've got the electricity generation that we need. The electricity market, in my view, is broken because the big generating retailers have a market incentive to maximize their profits rather than invest in cheaper electricity generation that will benefit all New Zealanders. And I think we've got to fix that. In terms of issues around transmission, so there's two parts of that system. There's transmission, which is getting electricity from one part of the country to the other, and then the distribution, which are the lines companies that distribute things locally. Both of those do need more investment, but the level of investment required partly is determined by where we have to move electricity to and from. We need to generate more electricity locally if we want to bring those costs back down again to something that's more reasonable. So things like solar, which you can put on household roofs all up and down the country. You can put them on farm buildings all up and down the country as well. That actually reduces the need for investment in the national grid because you're generating the electricity much closer to where it's being used.
But what about the solar company that's recently collapsed from your government, I think, didn't it?
Well, from my understanding, and I've spoken to BlackRock about that because they were the investor in it, was that it was a badly constructed company, and that it wasn't well set up for financial success. I think that raises some pretty big questions about why BlackRock invested in it, if that was the case. But I don't think you should judge the whole value of solar based on that one company. If you look at Australia, for example, they've had huge uptake of solar. I think they've got 5-6 times more solar on households there. It might even be a magnitude even higher than that, than New Zealand. And as a result, those households are paying less for their power than they are here in New Zealand.
Feel like we need solar in Christchurch. It's been nice the past 3 days. Just a couple of other quick questions. You said allowing ACT and New Zealand First to call the shots. Christopher Luxon has turned his back on promises he made. Promises like what?
Well, I think if you look at, let's go right back to the formation of the government, smoke-free. The National Party in the last election campaign were very clear they wanted to continue New Zealand heading towards smoke-free. One of the first things they did was abolish the smoke-free laws that we had put in place to achieve that. the list could go on. Christopher Luxon said during the campaign he wouldn't support the Treaty Principles Bill. He then did do that. He said that he was going to focus on making the cost of living the number one issue for the government, and they're making the cost of living worse for New Zealanders. He said they were going to keep the food in schools program, and yet David Seymour's basically cut it in half, and is now, and as you know, you've seen the fiasco that he's created there. Everywhere you turn, you'll find examples of where ACT and New Zealand First are calling the shots. And Christopher Luxon just seems to be letting them get away with it. But I think even more concerning for a lot of Kiwis is the standards of ministerial behaviour and conduct that they should be able to expect from their government don't seem to apply to ministers in New Zealand First or ACT under this government. You know, you got Winston Peters attacking the media, threatening to cut their funding when he doesn't agree with the line of questioning. You've got David Seymour and others criticising judges and really, which is a big no-no. You know, ministers shouldn't be telling judges what to do. And yet Christopher Luxon does nothing.
Having said that, I mean, I know that you and other opposition leaders have called the government, the coalition of chaos. But conversely, when you've got the Māori Party not wanting to go to meetings it's supposed to be going to, when you've got a Green MP with questionable material and another one who was found, for theft. I mean, you could go the other way, they couldn't use. I mean, it seems like Labour and both National have issues with this whole MMP environment because you've both got, potentially minor parties that you may not want to have to deal with.
No, I think there is a difference here in that it's not an apples for apples comparison. So as opposition parties, we're each completely independent of one another. When you're in government and you're holding a ministerial role, you are accountable to the Prime Minister. So the Māori Party and the Greens aren't accountable to me in any way, shape or form for anything they do or they say. They're separate, independent political parties. But were they in government and were we in government with them, then the actions of their ministers are questions for the Prime Minister to answer for. And there are some really clear guidelines around that. We have a thing called the Cabinet Manual, which sets out the rules around what ministers can and can't do. And they should apply equally to all ministers. And it's the Prime Minister's job to enforce that. So, were we in government with the Greens or with the Māori Party or both, my expectation would be very clear. They are expected to adhere to the Cabinet Manual the same as Labour ministers would be. And I wouldn't have tolerance for them stepping outside that in the way that Christopher Luxon does with his current government.
Do you worry come next election you may have to be dealing with the Māori Party or the Greens who tend to be getting to a kind of fringe protest environment? They're becoming more activists. They're not the Green Party of Rod Donald or Jeanette Fitzsimon anymore, or Tariara Turia, for example. Moderates. They're not moderates, is what I'm saying.
They've always been pretty activist parties. I mean, if you go back and you look at what the Māori Party was saying back in 2005, 2006, 2007, they were very radical then as well. And then they ended up spending 9 years in coalition government with John Key. So, I think what parties say in opposition, in order to generate a bit of energy behind themselves and how they behave in government, you can't always draw those distinctions. But I would say, ACT and New Zealand First at the moment are pretty radical in government. And the Prime Minister doesn't seem to be doing much about that. My job between now and the next election is to maximise Labour's share of the vote. I want to get as many votes for Labour as possible because, yes, while under MMP you do need to work with other parties, your bargaining position during that is much, much greater depending on, what the share of your vote is. So the more votes we get for Labour, the more stable the sort of government we'd be able to deliver would be.
Okay, just finally, give me one strategy you're going to try and implement to achieve that, to bring perhaps more voters, perhaps from the centre, back to Labour who may have thought that Labour's turned just a little bit too radical for them. Here's your chance and I'll invoice you later.
Well, as I said, I want to get Labour's focus back to those core basic areas that I know are important to all New Zealanders: jobs, health, homes, making sure that we're creating a better future for the country. For a long time now, my whole lifetime, working families have been told if you work hard, you'll be able to get ahead and create a better life for yourself and for your families. And yet so many don't feel like that's the case. They're working harder and harder. We work some of the longest hours in the OECD, and yet people feel like they're going backwards. We've got to change that. We've got to have an economy that works for all working New Zealanders, not just those who are doing really well.
Chris Hipkins, nice to see you again. Thanks so much for your time this evening.
Cheers, Chris. Great to talk to you.